For today's class, we are beginning our discussion of the nervous system. The nervous system is a complex system. When you think about the nervous system, you often think of the brain, which is nervous tissue within the cranium, the spinal cord, which is nervous tissue within the vertebral column, but there's also nervous tissue that is outside of the brain and spinal cord, and that nervous tissue is called nerves. The term for a nerve cell is a neuron, and the neuron generally consists of three parts. You have the cell body, or soma, which is the main part of the nerve cell. The cell body contains the nucleus, which houses the genetic information for the cell. You have what's called dendrites. These are tree-like projections that extend from the cell body. And these dendrites, they are going to receive impulses or messages from another neuron, and they're going to carry that information to the cell body. It's there in the cell body that impulse becomes processed. And from that cell body, that impulse is then going to travel along a long projection of the cell body, which is called the axon. The axon is then going to carry that impulse or message, again, away from the cell body to where it's going to be transmitted to another neuron. Now, wrapping around the axon is a fatty substance. This fatty substance is produced by Schwann cells, and it's called myelin. And because that myelin wraps around the axon, it's called a myelin sheath. The purpose of the myelin sheath is it insulates the neuron. And together with these gaps that are in between each segment of the myelin sheath, which are called node of Ranvier, this sheath and the nodes of Ranvier are going to allow the nerve impulse to be transmitted quickly and efficiently along that axon. So it's important to have that myelin and those nodes so that axon can travel quickly to the next neuron. Now, once the impulse reaches the end of the neuron, which is called the axon terminal, that impulse is going to be transferred to another nerve cell. And that happens at a space that's called the synapse. The synapse is the space between two neurons. And this is where communication occurs between two neurons. Now that we've looked at basic structures within the neuron, we're now going to talk about the nerve impulse. Nerve impulses are sometimes called action potentials, and they are waves of electrical activity that are going to travel along the neuron. Now, a nerve impulse must be stimulated by a stimulus, and it's the stimulus that creates the impulse. A stimulus is something that causes a change in environment. It's something that can elicit or evoke a physiological response in a cell, a tissue, or an organism. So in this case, the stimulus is going to elicit a change that's detected by the neurons. And this impulse is going to travel into the neuron by way of the dendrite and then out the neuron to the following neuron by way of the axon in the axon terminal. At the end of the axon, which is that axon terminal, a neurotransmitter is released. And a neurotransmitter is a chemical messenger. It carries, boosts, or balances that signal or impulse between neurons. And it's those neurotransmitters that allow the neurons to communicate with one another. That neurotransmitter is going to do that because it carries that impulse across that synapse, that space between the neurons, and to the next dendrite. Now, there are 3 types of neurons, and these neuron types are classified according to the direction in which they transmit impulses. You have sensory neurons, which are also called afferent neurons, and they're going to send information from sensory receptors, such as receptors found in your skin, your eyes, ears, nose, and tongue, to the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord. This is going to allow us to be able to sense things like taste, smell, hearing, seeing, and touch. You have motor neurons, or efferent neurons, and they are going to transmit impulses from the brain and spinal cord, so from the central nervous system to muscles, organs, and glands. And it's these motor neurons that play a role in both our voluntary and involuntary movement. And then you have the 3rd type of neuron, which are called associative or interneurons. And these interneurons are located within the central nervous system, so you find them in your brain and in your spinal cord, and they send information between that sensory and motor neuron. Now, these interneurons, interestingly, these are the most common type of neuron. And here in this picture, you can see an example of how these types of neurons work together. For example, if you were to touch something prickly, like, say, a cactus, those sensory neurons are going to send a signal to the interneurons in your spinal cord. Some interneurons are going to pass that signal to a motor neuron, and that motor to the motor neuron in your hand, and this is going to allow you to move your hand away. And then you have other interneurons which are going to send a signal to the pain center in your brain, letting you know that when you touch something prickly, that causes you to experience pain. And that is an example of how the different types of neurons work together. And this concludes our introduction to the nervous system.